Today's video, we're going to take a look at the third element required for forming a valid contract, and that is capacity. So in order for a contract to be valid, both parties must have the capacity to enter into that agreement voluntarily. Now this whiteboard up here, it kind of looks like, whoa, there's a whole bunch of information, but this the capacity rules are actually really, really simple. Once you kind of break them down a little bit, there's three basic types of capacity issues, or three types of issues that can create capacity problems that you certainly need to watch out for in any type of a contract negotiation, any type of a contract situation. But the effect of all three is pretty much going to be exactly the same in terms of the implication for whether the contract is going to be enforceable. So really with capacity issues, you're just kind of making sure to be keeping an eye out. And I guess this is kind of more of this is sort of partially an exam tip, right? When you're looking at any kind of a question on an exam, you always want to keep an eye out, just kind of in the back of your mind. Make sure that you're spotting any facts that are given to you that could raise a red flag, that kind of make you question whether there's some capacity issue. But just make sure that you're identifying any type of capacity issue. And once you've done that, you can pretty much head over here and go through the effect, basically go through the analysis of the effect of that capacity problem, and it's going to be exactly the same no matter what the issue is. So the three main capacity issues to watch out for. One of them is based on age. We just call that entering into a contract with minor. So I've got minority up here. In every state in the United States except for Alabama, the age of majority is 18. In Alabama, it's 19. So if you have a situation where you enter into a contract with anyone who is under that age of majority, so anyone who is considered a minor, that is going to be a potential significant capacity problem, and that can interfere with the validity of your contract. If you at any point have rented an apartment, or you had to sign a lease here in the state, I know a lot of students may move off campus before before they turn 19. And when I'm in class, I'll always ask my students, hey, who in here, had to go and sign a lease prior to turning 19 and had to get a parent or somebody to sign as an additional party. And everybody, right? There's nobody in the room, in any classroom I've ever taught in, who entered into a lease prior to age 19 and who did not have to have that signature of a parent. And so we'll talk about kind of why that is and why that's such a good practice in just a minute. The second capacity issue is just basically, you can just kind of file this one under any kind of incompetency type of an issue. So this could be mental illness. This could be something like Alzheimer's or dementia. Anything that would interfere with a person's ability to understand the nature of the agreement that they're entering into. And I'll have more to say in just a second on kind of that standard that we're looking at in terms of how much the incompetency has to affect you, because it's very closely related to our third classification, or our third type of capacity issue. Our third issue is intoxication. And that would be, of course, drug use, alcohol use, anything along those lines. Again, that's going to interfere with your mental faculties and your ability to understand what it is that you're doing. Now, with number one, right, with the age of majority issue, that's just a straight line cutoff, right? It doesn't matter that, yes, there are 17 and 18-year-olds who are more mature than a lot of 30-year-olds. Doesn't matter, right? We're not going to get into that kind of analysis. It's just a bright line rule. If you're under the age of majority, you lack capacity to enter into a contract, period. If you're over, you have it. That's a very straightforward test to apply in terms of whether somebody is a minor or not. With incompetency and with intoxication, it's a little bit different. I've got down here the kind of best like shorthand description that I could come up with that would fit in this amount of whiteboard. I've got on there pretty severe. Um, Basically, we're not talking about, you had a couple drinks and went out and bought a bunch of things on Amazon that you kind of later wish that you had not bought, okay? We're not talking about like, oh, your judgment is a little bit impaired, or gee, I wouldn't have done that if I was sober, that kind of a deal. We're talking about kind of a much higher level of um, incapacitation or effect on your decision making and your understanding. Same with incompetency. So, if you, I mean, mental illness is something that is extremely, it's extremely common, right? You may have, any number of people that we're walking around with every single day who are dealing with, generalized anxiety disorder or depression or whatever it is. So we're certainly not saying that anyone who has literally any type of mental illness or any kind of, we're not saying that none of these people can enter into a contract. Okay, even if you have an elderly person who occasionally is getting confused, right? You could even have someone who is in the earlier stages of Alzheimer's, who is perfectly competent to enter into a contract, and that's perfectly fine, right? We would not say there's a capacity problem. So it's not like, we have a diagnosis and now there's a cutoff, you can't enter into a contract. We have to go through a more detailed analysis than that. And what we're basically looking at with both incompetency issues and with intoxication is the impairment is at the level that you basically don't even understand that when you're entering into a contract that it's a legally binding document, that it is going to impose enforceable obligations on you. So again, it's not like making, sort of a poor judgment call or, I was, had a few drinks, and so somebody talked me into a higher price, right, than like I normally would have agreed to pay. We're not talking about that, right? Because in that example, I understand what it is that, what duties are going to be required by me. I understand that I'm signing a contract. I understand what a contract is and what it does. So to get to the point where we would say there's a capacity problem, it's actually a very high standard that you need to show. If you're on the side of raising incompetence or intoxication as a defense, right? If you're being sued for breach of contract and you're trying to establish, hey, look, right, I was so drunk that I lacked the capacity to enter into the contract, it's actually something that's fairly difficult to do because it is a high showing. And you really need to be able to show that you didn't even understand kind of the nature and consequences of what it was that you were doing. So, with that being said, in all three of these cases, the effect is the same. And basically, what happens in a situation where one of the parties to a contract lacks the capacity is that we classify the contract as voidable. So again, it's not valid because we're lacking an element. What we do here is say that the contract is voidable. Now, notice that's not saying the contract is void, right? It is possible that you could have a situation where you enter into a contract, one of the parties lacks capacity, everybody performs their end of the bargain later, and everything turns out fine and like nothing ever happens and everybody walks away happy. That's possible, right? Now, in a totally void contract, right, we would say, that there truly was no contract at all to begin with. That any court, if there were any dispute involving the contract, any court would say, we're not even going to touch this. This is not even, that this was. It's as if no contract existed. With a contract that's voidable, we're acknowledging, right, that there was a contract that existed. But what it means is that one, or sometimes both parties in a voidable contract may have the option to completely avoid the contract obligation. Now, this can be a situation of prior to performance, right? So if I lack capacity to enter into a contract, but nevertheless, I sign a contract to buy a car, right? Maybe at some point later, I refuse to pay. I'm sued for breach of contract. I can raise this as a defense at that point. However, right, that even beyond that, if let's say that I lack capacity, I enter into the contract to buy the car, I actually pay the money. Later on, right, if I can show that I lacked capacity at the time that I signed that contract, I can actually come back later on and say, hey, I want my money back, right? So it's not just about enforcing performance that hasn't happened yet. When we say that a contract is voidable, it means you can have a situation where both parties have already performed, and one of the parties is able to come back later and say, hey, never mind, I want to undo the whole thing. Now, obviously, in my example of me buying the car, I would have to return the car, right? But I may be able to get the entire purchase price back if I can show that I lacked capacity. And that's one thing that's definitely key to point out in these capacity issues. The option, right, that ability to say, hey, I'm going to avoid that contract obligation, or the kind of official term for that is to disaffirm the contract. That ability only rests with the person who lacked capacity. So it's not, you know, if it's the car dealership, right, that I bought the car from, if there's no capacity issues on the dealership side, they can't, raise my lack of capacity as any kind of a defense, or, there's nothing that they can do about it. Basically, if I want to go through with the contract and I'm perfectly happy with everything, they're not going to be able to get out of it based on my lack of capacity. So only the person lacking capacity has that option to disaffirm. Now, there's some timing issues to be aware of here as far as when that decision to disaffirm can be made. The first one is while that party still lacks capacity, you can disaffirm while you're lacking capacity. So over here, right, if it's a situation where, let's stick with Alabama since we're here in Alabama, if you sell a car to a 16-year-old, that 16-year-old has all the way up until the time they turn 19 to disaffirm that contract if they choose to do so, if they want their money back. Now, obviously, they have to give you the car back. But, one thing that I get questioned on a lot from students is, what happens if the 16-year-old goes out and wrecks the car, right? And then comes back and says, hey, I want to disaffirm the contract. Well, that actually depends on the state. So some states will say that if there's any damage or even just basic depreciation to the vehicle, that money has to be taken off, deducted basically from the purchase price. So if the car, has $2,000 worth of damage to it, you would have to, the miner would have to give you the car back. You would have to give back whatever the purchase price was minus $2,000. However, that's not every state. And some states actually say it doesn't matter, right? If there's been damage, if there's been depreciation, whatever it is, the idea is if you enter into a contract with someone lacking capacity, that risk is on you. And even if the car has been damaged or even totaled, if that 16-year-old prior to turning 19 comes back to you and says, hey, I want my money back, here's your totaled car, you get to take the totaled car back and you give back the full purchase price. I believe that is the minority rule in states now. So I think that's less common to see, but there are still at least a handful of states that will follow that rule. That is, again, because of the impact here, this is why it's so important. If you end up in any kind of career, any kind of business where you may be dealing with younger people, right? I mean, higher ed is a perfect example, or anybody who's catering to higher ed markets, right? If you're in a business in a college town, you've got to be aware of these capacity rules and ask for a signature from a third party, a parent or a guardian, another adult who's willing to co-sign on any kind of a contract that you enter into with somebody who is a minor. And then, of course, too, right, and this is a good, law and business ethics kind of an overlap. Obviously, right, if you're dealing with any kind of a party, you're negotiating or having any kind of discussion about entering into a contract with someone, if you have any indication that this is somebody who is intoxicated. If you're getting any kind of signs that this is someone who is confused, whether it's the result of mental illness or whether it's someone who's dealing with dementia or Alzheimer's or whatever it is, you need to stop and really consider what it is that you're doing, and make sure, right, get some verification before you move forward. And because again, if it does turn out later that there's some capacity problem, you're not going to be able to rely on the enforcement of that contract. And not only are you not going to be able to enforce it, right, even if it's already been performed, you may have a situation where the other party's coming back to you and saying, hey, I want to undo the entire transaction. Okay, so back to our timing rules here. So while any party lacks capacity, and so obviously we did the minority example. Incompetency, one thing that comes up a lot in some of these cases is with Alzheimer's, for example, with some types of dementia, I think as well are pretty similar to this. A lot of people with Alzheimer's will have like kind of lucid times, but then more confused times where they're suffering more symptoms. And it kind of can come and go as far as like the effect of the disease on the mind. If a person with Alzheimer's signs a contract during a lucid period where they did understand what they were doing, there's no capacity problem. But obviously, you get into a lot of difficulty later on when these disputes come up in terms of trying to determine, okay, on the date and time that this person signed the contract, right? How were they being affected by this disease? So that can get a little bit messy just in terms of trying to figure that out, sometimes months or even years after the fact, if disputes come up. But if you had a situation where someone, while they were being very affected by something like Alzheimer's, so they lack capacity, they sign a contract, the entire for the entire period that incapacity continues, right, while they're still in that confused state, if they somehow kind of while they're still confused, take it back or say they want to disaffirm or whatever, they can do that. With intoxication, that one's pretty straightforward. When you sober up or when the drugs wear off, is when that capacity problem goes away. But if you enter into a contract when you're so drunk that you lack capacity, the whole time you're super drunk and lacking capacity, you have the option to disaffirm. Now, in addition to while a person is lacking capacity, you can exercise the option to disaffirm. It's also possible to disaffirm within a reasonable time after gaining capacity. Okay, so when that capacity problem goes away, you've got a reasonable time after that to make the decision to disaffirm. So in our example up here, when you sold the 16-year-old the car, they've got all the way up until the time in Alabama that they turn 19. And then for a reasonable time after that, right, upon turning 19, where they could exercise that option to disaffirm. Now, again, reasonable time rules make me nervous. They should make you nervous. That's very fuzzy. You would really have to dig into the case law in terms of trying to determine, right, like what is a reasonable time. It may be, weeks or months in the example of age of minority. If it's a situation where it's intoxication, which is like a much more temporary kind of a state, it might be a shorter period after that. And again, though, I'm not telling you that for certain. I'm saying this is likely something that's going to depend on your state. It's going to depend on the precedent that you have from your courts in interpreting these laws. And you'd really have to go into the detail to try to figure out, what have courts said in terms of what amount of time are we talking about here. But that kind of uncertainty is another reason why, it's another layer of uncertainty here that should make you very wary about entering into these contracts to begin with. Just try really hard not to enter into a contract with anyone with a capacity problem, because it can certainly turn into a headache. In the examples of incompetency, okay, again, like we just said, with Alzheimer's, if you have a situation where the symptoms kind of go away a little bit, and a person, you know, who's suffering from the disease has a clear day or a few days. They have a reasonable time kind of upon entering that state of clarity to make a decision. And then with intoxication, you've got a reasonable time after you sober up to exercise that option to disaffirm. Now, oh, one term I forgot here. See if we can figure out where to put it. Don't really have a good space, so I'm just going to block off a little down here, and I'm going to write down, because you'll see this in your readings probably. Okay. Hopefully you can see that. That says ratify. Ratify. Ratification is the option of, or I'm sorry, is the opposite of disaffirming a contract. If you have a situation where, let's say that the 16-year-old buys your car, turns 19 years old, okay, reasonable time period goes by, nothing has happened. What we say is that there's been an implied ratification of that contract, right? So the 19-year-old did not have to come back to you and say, hey, I just wanted to let you know, right? I know that I bought that car when I was 16. I am now 19. I'm very happy with this car. I still really appreciate the deal that you gave me on it, and therefore I would like to keep the car and ratify the contract, okay? Maybe they'll do that, sure. If they do, that's called an express ratification, and that's certainly a possibility. But even if they don't do that, once that reasonable time passes after they've reached the age of majority, we basically say that it's an implied ratification. But the point is, right, by keeping the car and choosing not to disaffirm, kind of by definition, you've ratified the contract later on. And again, that can happen too with any form of capacity type of an issue. Once we've got our drunk person here, once our drunk person sobers up, right, he may go to the other party and say, hey, like, just saw that I, ordered 80,000, 80 pounds of rubber ducks, right, from you. Awesome, right? Like, good for drunk me. I made a great decision. I'm really excited to get the ducks. Okay, so in that example, there's been an express ratification. On the other hand, it could just be a situation where they just go along with it. Reasonable time passes after they're sober. Nothing happens. They keep the ducks. There's no arguments. We would call that a ratification too. So again, right, a lot of information kind of here, up here. And it sort of looks like a lot while it's all up here on this board. But the basic rules are actually fairly straightforward once you kind of unpack the different types of capacity issues and then recognize that, okay, once we've identified one of these, we know that our effect is going to be the same, and then we just have to understand what avoidable contract is and what that allows a kind of a protected party to do. There are other types of issues aside from capacity that can make contracts avoidable. We will talk about some of those in a later video. Fraud is a good example. If there's been like intentional misrepresentation in a contract negotiation, that would give the innocent party the option to disaffirm the contract once the fraud is discovered. So there are some other examples of contracts that, or of issues that can make a contract avoidable. But capacity is certainly one that's very important. In a lot of instances, it's very, you have a lot of control over it, right? And that's kind of the good news is it is something that you can avoid if you're being careful, certainly, by making sure that anyone you enter into a contract with is of the age of majority. And then, of course, just kind of, I guess, sort of just being aware and kind of on the lookout for any other red flags that could affect a person's competency or whether or not somebody's intoxicated. And again, just from a business ethics standpoint, it's not a good idea to enter into agreements with people suffering from capacity issues anyway, but it is something certainly to watch out for because of the legal implications. Okay.